It was one of the worst snowstorms Summit County had seen in years. Two young women set out that evening on opposite sides of the same small town, both trying to get home before the roads disappeared under the snow. Neither one made it. One of them was found the very next day, half buried near the summit of a mountain pass, shot through the chest. The other one simply vanished. No body, no answers, nothing, for 6 months, until a boy fishing in a creek stumbled onto something no child should ever find. 2 women. Same night, same town, shot within hours of each other in 2 different locations by what investigators would eventually realize was the same man. And for almost 40 years, nobody knew who he was. He wasn't some drifter who blew through town and vanished. He wasn't some stranger from out of state. The man who killed them had been rescued from the same storm that killed them on the same night, less than a mile from where the bodies would eventually be found. For decades, his name was sitting quietly in the case file, not as a suspect, but as a footnote, a man who got lucky, a man the storm let live. It would take almost 4 decades, a piece of DNA the size of a pinhead, and a technology that didn't exist when these women died, to finally connect all of it. This is the story of Annette Schnee and Bobbi Jo Oberholtzer, and the man who hid in plain sight for nearly 40 years. Before we get into what happened to them, if you're the kind of person who needs to know how a case like this finally gets solved, subscribe now, because that's exactly what this channel exists to do. Breckenridge, Colorado in January of 1982 was still, in many ways, a small town pretending to be a big destination. The ski industry had already turned it into a name people across the country recognized, but underneath the tourism, it was still a mountain community of a few thousand people, where everybody who actually lived there year-round tended to know everybody else, at least by face. It drew a very particular kind of young person: seasonal workers, ski instructors, bartenders, people who came out for one winter season and sometimes just never left, because the mountains had a way of keeping people longer than they'd planned to stay. It was the kind of place where hitchhiking wasn't dangerous, or at least didn't feel that way in 1982. Gas was expensive, a lot of seasonal workers didn't own cars, and the roads between Breckenridge and the smaller surrounding communities, places like Blue River and Alma, weren't long. You worked your shift, walked out to the road when it ended, stuck your thumb out, and somebody drove you home. Half the time, it was someone you already knew. It wasn't recklessness, it was just how a town like that functioned in the winter, when the weather made walking home on foot genuinely dangerous in its own right. Annette Schnee was 21 years old. She worked at a bar in town, the kind of job that was common among people her age in Breckenridge: flexible hours, decent tips, a paycheck that covered rent on a mountain town budget. But she had ambitions that reached well beyond Summit County. She wanted to be a flight attendant. She wanted to see cities and countries that had nothing to do with ski lifts or snow, and everyone who knew her described her the same way, as someone who felt like she was just getting started, still deciding which direction her life was going to take. Her younger sister, Cindy, was only 11 years old at the time and looked up to Annette the way little sisters do toward the older sibling who seems impossibly grown, impossibly cool, impossibly permanent, the kind of person you assume will simply always be there. Barbara Oberholtzer, who everyone in her life called Bobbi Jo, was 29. She was married, building a life in Breckenridge with her husband that looked, from the outside, like exactly the kind of ordinary, quietly happy existence most people spend their 20s trying to construct. On the evening of January 6th, she was out with friends in town, enjoying one more night before the weather turned as bad as everyone knew it was going to. These 2 women did not know each other. They worked different jobs. They moved in different social circles. As far as investigators would ever determine, in nearly 40 years of looking, their paths had never once crossed before that night. The only thing that connected them was geography, timing, and the man who was about to end both of their lives within hours of each other. At around 4:45 in the afternoon, on January 6, 1982, Annette Schnee finished up at the bar and started the trip home to Blue River, a small community a few miles south of Breckenridge. It was a trip she'd likely made dozens of times before, too far to comfortably walk in a building snowstorm, too routine and too short a distance to think twice about hitchhiking it the way she probably always did. She was last seen a little before 5 o'clock that afternoon, thumb out on the side of the road, waiting for a ride that should have taken her home in 15 minutes. That same night, hours later, as the storm kept intensifying, Bobbi Jo Oberholtzer said goodbye to her friends in town and started her own trip home, not to Blue River, but in the opposite direction, toward Alma, on the far side of a different mountain pass. Like Schnee, she was hitchhiking. Like Schnee, it should have been routine, uneventful, forgettable by morning. Neither woman made it home. By the following morning, Bobbi Jo's absence had escalated from mild concern into real alarm. Friends and family who hadn't heard from her overnight, in a storm bad enough that nobody wanted to imagine her stuck out in it, began searching, working backward along the route she would have taken, checking the roadside, calling anyone who might have seen her. What they found first wasn't her. It was her belongings, scattered near Hoosier Pass in the snow, her backpack, still packed with her identification cards, a single wool glove, a tissue stained with blood, and lying near all of it, almost easy to overlook against the white ground, a single orange booty sock. At the time, nobody understood what that sock would eventually mean. It read, in that moment, as just one more disturbing detail in a scene that was rapidly transforming from a missing person search into something far worse. The search continued upward, toward the summit of Hoosier Pass, nearly 11,500 feet above sea level, a brutal stretch of road even in good weather, let alone during one of the worst storms of the year. About 20 feet off the highway, down a steep, snow-covered embankment, they found her. Bobbi Jo Oberholtzer had been shot in the chest. She was gone. The discovery tore through a town that size wasn't built to absorb. In a community as tight-knit as Breckenridge, this wasn't an abstract crime happening to a stranger somewhere far away. This was someone's coworker, someone's regular at the bar, someone people had almost certainly shared a drink or a shift with days earlier. And now, there was a killer somewhere in Summit County who had shot a young woman on the side of the road and left her in the snow like she meant nothing at all. But even as that horror set in, there was a second, quieter crisis unfolding in parallel. Annette Schnee still hadn't come home, and unlike Oberholtzer, there was no scattered evidence, no scene to search, no trail of belongings leading investigators anywhere. She had simply vanished into the storm, as completely and silently as if the mountain itself had swallowed her. Her family held on the way, families do in that impossible in-between space, unwilling to fully accept the worst, while somewhere underneath the hope, already sensing exactly what it probably meant. Her mother spent the following months in the particular kind of grief that has no shape to it, no funeral to plan, no grave to visit, just an empty room and a missing daughter who should have walked through the door on an ordinary Wednesday, and simply never did. 11-year-old Cindy watched her mother come apart in slow motion, in a way that only a child can watch, helplessly, without the language yet to understand what she was seeing. 6 months passed like that. Winter melted into spring, spring into summer, and with the snow went whatever forensic evidence might have still been recoverable at a fresh scene, if there had ever been a scene to find in the first place. Then, in the middle of that summer, in a stretch of rural Park County, nowhere near where anyone had actively been searching anymore, a young boy went fishing in a creek. He found her there. Annette Schnee's body had been in that creek for 6 months. She had been shot in the back. 2 women, same storm, both hitchhiking, both shot, both left in remote locations, miles apart from each other and from town, as if the person responsible had wanted maximum distance between the 2 scenes, maximum difficulty for anyone trying to connect them. Investigators believed almost immediately that the murders were linked. The timing was too precise, the method too similar, the geography too close for coincidence. But belief and proof are 2 entirely different things, especially in 1982. There was no surveillance footage on a mountain pass, no cell towers logging locations, no forensic databases capable of matching DNA to a name, because DNA profiling as an investigative tool didn't even exist yet in any usable form. Investigators had 2 crime scenes, some physical evidence recovered from the snow, a single orange sock nobody could yet explain, and absolutely no mechanism for turning any of it into a suspect. They tried anyway. Detectives spent the early months of the investigation interviewing everyone who had any connection to either woman, co-workers, friends, boyfriends, anyone in the small, overlapping social world of a ski town with a known history of aggression or violence. They tried to trace the sock. They tried to trace the glove. They pursued every thread the physical evidence offered, and every single one of those threads eventually went nowhere, dead-ending against the limits of what 1982 forensic science could actually accomplish. As the years passed, the case did what unsolved cases in small towns inevitably do. It faded out of daily conversation without ever actually disappearing from the lives of the people who loved these 2 women. Cindy French grew up carrying the specific, unresolved grief of a sister who never came home. No closure, no answer, just an absence that got older along with her. Bobbi Jo's husband carried an equivalent weight for decades, the particular loneliness of loving someone whose killer has a case file but no name. Detectives who worked the case as young officers in 1982 eventually retired, some without ever getting the resolution they'd spent years chasing. New investigators inherited the file the way cold cases always get inherited, a box of physical evidence, decades of interview transcripts, and the accumulated weight of every previous attempt that had led, cumulatively, to nothing solid enough to bring before a jury. The Schnee family refused to simply let the system work at its own pace. At some point, unwilling to keep waiting for a call that never seemed to come, they privately hired an investigator named Charlie McCormick, who spent literal decades working the case on their behalf, outside the department, independently, refusing to let it quietly die the way so many cold cases eventually do when the trail goes cold and the manpower gets reassigned elsewhere. For most of 40 years, that persistence was the only thing keeping the case alive at all. What the case actually needed was a piece of technology that simply didn't exist yet anywhere in the world. The ability to take a tiny, badly degraded sample of decades-old DNA and turn it into an actual identity, without the suspect's own DNA ever having been on file with police in the first place. That technology finally arrived through a forensic science company called United Data Connect, which specialized in exactly this kind of advanced extraction and genetic genealogy analysis, techniques capable of pulling usable genetic material out of evidence that older labs would have written off as too degraded to bother testing. McCormick eventually connected the Schnee family with the company, and once involved, they attempted something nobody working the case in 1982 could have imagined: extracting a viable DNA profile from decades-old evidence and running it against public genealogy databases, the same kind of consumer platforms ordinary people use to trace their ancestry and locate long-lost relatives. This process is nothing like the instant matches dramatized on television. Investigators don't simply type in a sample and receive a name. What they get instead is a sprawling web of genetic relatives, third cousins, second cousins, distant branches of a family tree belonging to people who have absolutely no idea that a harmless ancestry test they took out of curiosity is about to help crack open a 40-year-old double murder. From there, genealogists work backward methodically, cross-referencing age, geography, and family history, narrowing an enormous field of statistical possibility down, generation by generation, to a short list of real, living people. In this case, that short list eventually narrowed to 2 brothers. Only one of them had ever lived in Colorado. His name was Alan Lee Phillips. When investigators pulled his name and went back through the original 1982 files, they found something that had been sitting in plain sight the entire time, unnoticed for nearly 4 decades. On the exact same night, Annette Schnee and Bobbi Jo Oberholtzer disappeared. During the exact same storm, a man's truck had gotten stuck near Hoosier Pass, and he'd needed to be rescued by authorities responding to the weather emergency that night. That man was Alan Lee Phillips. He hadn't simply been in the area. He had been rescued from the very storm that claimed both women's lives, on the same road, essentially at the scene, documented on paper in the original case file for almost 40 years. not as a suspect, but as an unrelated footnote. A man the mountain happened to let live. Investigators now believe Phillips wasn't simply a passerby caught in bad weather that night. He had been actively hunting for victims along that stretch of road, using the storm itself as cover, understanding that hitchhikers stranded in a whiteout would have no realistic choice but to accept a ride from whoever stopped for them. By February of 2021, investigators had enough to move. Phillips, by then 70 years old, working as a semi-retired mechanic, was arrested during a traffic stop near his own home in the small mountain community of Dumont, Colorado. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of first-degree assault, and 2 counts of kidnapping. The arrest made headlines across the entire state, a genuine, once-in-a-generation moment where a case nearly 4 decades old suddenly had a face, a name, an actual living person attached to it after so many years of nothing. For Cindy French, the 11-year-old who had grown into an adult, still defined, in part, by the sister she lost and never got an answer for, it represented something almost impossible to describe in words. For Bobbi Jo's husband, after decades of carrying an identical weight, it meant the same thing arriving at last, so long after the question was first asked that the answer barely felt real when it finally came. The trial began more than a year later and stretched across 2.5 weeks as prosecutors laid out, piece by piece, exactly how modern forensic technology had recovered a usable genetic profile from evidence that had been sitting in storage since 1982. One detail emerged during testimony that added a devastating new dimension to the case. Bobbi Jo Oberholtzer had fought back, hard enough, for long enough, that traces of her attacker's DNA survived on her body for nearly 40 years, preserved by circumstance and cold storage, waiting patiently for the science to finally catch up to what she'd left behind in her final moments. Investigators would later say directly that her resistance that night was what ultimately allowed both cases to be solved at all. That her fight for her own life ended up being the evidence that convicted her killer decades later. The jury deliberated for 5 hours. In September 2022, Alan Lee Phillips was convicted on 8 counts, including first-degree murder in the deaths of both Annette Schnee and Barbara Oberholtzer, along with kidnapping charges connected to both women. He maintained his innocence throughout the trial, and his defense team argued the DNA evidence used to convict him had been contaminated or improperly handled somewhere along the chain of custody spanning 4 decades. The jury did not find that argument credible. 2 months later, Phillips stood in a Park County courtroom for sentencing. Prosecutors read aloud a statement from Bobbi Jo's husband, describing the way a single night of violence had rippled outward through both families for 40 uninterrupted years. Grief that never fully resolves, that simply spreads further with every year that passes untouched by justice. He called Phillips a despicable and evil man, and said he hoped that everyone whose life had been shattered that night could someday, finally, find some form of peace now that the truth was known. Alan Lee Phillips was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in prison, without any possibility of parole. He did not speak at his own sentencing. His attorney indicated he intended to appeal the conviction. He will die in prison. What makes this case almost impossible to shake isn't only the horror of what happened to 2 young women on an ordinary snowy night in a mountain town where nothing like this was supposed to happen. It's the sheer, quiet audacity of how long the answer had been sitting in plain sight, completely undisturbed. Alan Lee Phillips didn't flee Colorado after murdering 2 women in a single night. He didn't change his identity or vanish somewhere far away, the way fiction tells us killers are supposed to behave. He stayed. He lived an ordinary, unremarkable life, less than an hour from where he had committed a double homicide, working as a mechanic, raising whatever life he built for himself, going decades without ever being seriously suspected, all while the record of his own rescue from that exact storm, on that exact night, sat quietly inside a case file that nobody thought to examine twice. It's the kind of detail that sounds almost too neat to be real. The storm that killed 2 women also very nearly killed the man who murdered them, and instead, it spared him, and then kept his secret for almost 40 years afterward. Real cases rarely offer that kind of irony. This one did, and it happened exactly that way, documented in official records the entire time. The technology that finally undid all of it didn't exist when Annette Schnee and Bobbi Jo Oberholtzer died. It barely existed when their families first genuinely began hoping for an answer decades later. It took a private investigator hired by a grieving family who simply refused to stop, a forensic science company willing to attempt an extraction from evidence most labs would have long since written off as too degraded to bother with, and a genetic genealogy process patient enough to work backward through an entire family tree, one distant, unsuspecting cousin at a time, until two brothers' names finally surfaced out of a field of statistical possibilities, numbering in the millions. For Cindy French, the little sister who was only 11 years old when her family's entire world quietly came apart, there is no version of justice capable of returning the decades she spent not knowing. For Bobbi Jo's husband, there is no verdict that undoes the years spent carrying a grief with no name attached to it, no face to direct that grief toward. But there is this: the case is no longer a mystery. The man responsible has a name, a face, and a prison cell he will die in. The single orange sock left behind in the snow in January of 1982 is no longer just a strange, unexplained detail sitting in an unsolved file somewhere. It is evidence, permanently entered into a courthouse record in a case that is now, finally, closed. Annette Schnee wanted to see the world beyond the mountains that raised her. Bobbi Jo Oberholtzer was quietly building a life with the husband she loved. Neither of them got the chance to finish what they'd started. But nearly 40 years later, in a Park County courtroom, their families finally received the one thing that mattered more than any sentence, more than any verdict: the truth, spoken out loud, in front of the man who had taken everything from them, and then simply gone on living as if he never would be found. If you believe cases like this deserve to be remembered, subscribe to get more true crime documentaries where forgotten cases finally get the justice they deserve.